For decades, I lived outside of my body. My hands, my spine, my breath, they felt like things that I had to manage, control, or push past. I moved fast. I stayed busy. I overachieved. And when I faltered, I punished myself. Quietly at first, and sometimes physically too. For a long time, I genuinely believed that was just how I was wired, that I was disciplined, that I was driven, that I was strong, and that I was called resilient. What I didn't understand yet was this. That wasn't my personality. It was my nervous system. And for many women with trauma histories, especially those who became high achievers, embodiment doesn't come naturally. We don't grow up learning how to inhabit our bodies. We learn how to override them instead. We move from one phase of life to the next, like school, then work, then caregiving, achievement, and responsibility, without ever stopping to ask what it's doing to us internally. And there's rarely space for us to pause and ask, what is my body carrying right now? Or what never got named? Trauma doesn't always look like chaos on the outside. Often, and especially for women, it looks like competence, productivity, being the one who holds it all together while feeling increasingly disconnected inside. And from a physiological perspective, this makes sense. When the nervous system learns early that slowing down isn't safe, that needs create problems, and that emotions aren't always necessarily welcome, or that rest invites criticism, then it adapts. Chronic activation becomes normal. Fight or flight becomes our baseline. And embodiment, actually feeling those sensations, feeling our emotions, our hunger, our fatigue, our pleasure, that can start to feel very threatening. And so instead of listening inward, we learn to manage this. And manage this can look like restriction, it can look like control, and it can look like pushing through. And this disconnection is often reinforced by culture. And so women are praised for our endurance. We are praised for being tireless, for producing without pausing. And research consistently shows that women are more likely to internalize stress. We are also more likely to override our bodily cues, and we begin to experience anxiety and depression and somatic tension, often without ever linking those experiences back to our trauma. And as Bessel van der Kolk famously wrote in The Body Keeps the Score, but for many women, the body also keeps quiet until it can't anymore. And what I understand now is this, that disembodiment was never failure. Disembodiment was adaptive. Disembodiment helped me survive. It helped me to succeed, and it helped me to keep going when stopping didn't feel like an option. But eventually, what once protected me began to cost me. It cost me physically and emotionally and relationally. And that's where embodiment enters the conversation. And when I talk about embodiment, it's really important that you understand that I'm not talking about loving your body overnight or slowing your life to a halt or doing anything forced or performative. For trauma survivors, embodiment is about relationship. Slowly rebuilding trust with a nervous system that has learned to live on override. And in this episode, we are going to explore what embodiment actually means in trauma work, how disconnection develops, particularly for high-achieving women, and what it can look like to begin to inhabit your body again without punishment or pressure or perfection. Because embodiment isn't about losing your drive. It's about no longer having to abandon yourself to keep going. And so here are 3 key takeaways to hold in mind from this episode. Number 1, disconnection is adaptive. Disconnection is not a flaw. So your body has learned strategies to protect you. And number 2, trauma changes how we inhabit our bodies. Things like speed and control and self-punishment often reinforce this disconnection. And finally, reclaiming your body starts with awareness. Noticing your breath, the tension you hold in your body, and movement signals safety to your nervous system. So let's dive in. Welcome to Reclaiming Me, a trauma-informed podcast helping women with complex PTSD heal the lasting impact of childhood attachment wounds from parents and caregivers, so you can finally release people-pleasing and perfectionism and learn to trust in relationships, beginning with the one you have with yourself. I'm your host, Cindy Payne, therapist, trauma specialist, and a woman who has walked this path both personally and professionally. All right, everybody. I am so glad that you are back with me this week for an episode on embodiment. And before we get started today, I want to give you a little context for what's coming on the show. I had planned to have 2 guests join us today, 2 play therapists who specialize in attachment and reparenting the self, especially for those navigating CPTSD. But due to some inclement weather in the Texas area, they're going to be on the show in a couple of weeks. But in the meantime, we are going to explore another important piece of this journey of healing, and that is what embodiment really means for women with trauma histories and how disconnection develops over time. So let's get started. So disconnection, what is it and how does it form? Well, disconnection, it doesn't happen overnight. And for many women with trauma histories, disconnection develops gradually across the phases of our lives, each one adding another layer. And so for me, disconnection didn't feel dramatic. There was no moment where I stopped and thought, I've left my body. It felt practical. It felt necessary, and it felt smart. Because as a child, I learned early on that noticing my body, my hunger, my fatigue, my discomfort wasn't safe sometimes, and it wasn't accepted always. And so staying attuned inward meant noticing needs that might not be met or emotions that felt really confusing and even reactions that were not always welcome. And so what did my nervous system do? It did what it is designed to do. It adapted. And so instead of listening inward, it started to stay alert outward. And this is what we call hypervigilance or compliance. And really, this is focused on other people's cues. And my body became something that I used to survive. And it was not something that I lived in. And I didn't think of this as disconnection. In fact, it felt like I was being good. It felt like I was really easygoing and really low maintenance. But what was really happening was this: safety became linked to performance and control and not presence. And as I moved into adolescence, this pattern didn't disappear. Rather, it evolved, and running fast, both literally and figuratively, became metaphorical for me. So I stayed really busy. I stayed really productive, and I stayed ahead of this emotional curve. And so movement became something that was not about joy or play. Movement was regulation for me. And so as I entered early adulthood, these strategies were praised. Overachievement, perfectionism, relentless self-monitoring. And from the outside, it looked like motivation and success. But on the inside, it felt like never having the chance to slow down. And if I was given the chance, then it felt deeply uncomfortable for me to try to slow down. And there was never any space to process any of this. And I'm not quite sure I would have even had the language to process any of it. And so what happens over time is that each phase for me, it just simply built on the last, layering coping strategies that would work at the time, but quietly it would just pull me further away from my body and my breath and eventually my sense of self. And this is incredibly common for us women. Many women don't experience trauma-related disconnection as numbness alone, but they experience it as this feeling of urgency and pressure and restlessness and chronic self-override. In fact, research shows that women are more than twice as likely as men to develop PTSD, not because we are weaker, but because relational trauma and our socialization condition us to internalize this distress. Women are more likely to suppress anger. We are way more likely to overfunction in relationships, taking on the responsibility for emotional harmony and endurance rather than resistance. And so over time, this creates kind of a functional disconnection. And what a functional disconnection means to me is that our body is present, but it is also highly managed and it's overridden, or it can also be punished into compliance. And this tension becomes normal. I know for me, fatigue has been something that has been ignored in me for a really long time. And also signals like hunger, pain, and emotional overwhelm, they are treated as inconveniences, not only by us, but by those around us in the relationships that we have formed. And As trauma therapist Janina Fisher reminds us, she says that trauma is not what happened to you, but rather it's what happened inside of you as a result of what happened. Just let that sink in for a second. So for many women, what happened inside was a nervous system that learned that staying useful is safer than staying connected. So if you're listening to this and you're thinking, I don't feel dramatic about my trauma, I just feel really tired, or maybe just really restless all the time, or just disconnected when others are connecting around me, that doesn't mean that nothing happened. It could mean that your nervous system has adapted intelligently. But as we are learning here together on this podcast, adaptation is not the same as embodiment. And that brings us to the next question. What is actually happening in the body when trauma leads to disconnection? So I want to get into some psychoeducation about trauma and the body so that you can understand what's going on internally as we grow closer to understanding embodiment. And one of the most important shifts in trauma research over the last few decades is this, that trauma isn't stored only in our memory or our thought. Trauma is actually stored on a cellular level inside of our bodies. And this can be especially hard for high-achieving women to accept, because what we have been taught is that if we understand something well enough, we should just be able to think our way out of it. This is called intellectualization, and I am a professional at this. So it could look like reading all of the literature about trauma and your patterns and your attachment wounds, but never really understanding the connection in how it shows up in your body. And we know that trauma does not live in logic alone. Bessel van der Kolk, again, he writes in The Body Keeps the Score that trauma, it fundamentally rewires our nervous system. And this is not metaphorical. This is physiological. And so when something overwhelms our capacity to cope, especially in childhood or within relationships that are supposed to be safe, our nervous system starts to reorganize itself around our survival. This is why symptoms like chronic muscle tension, fatigue, dissociation, or restlessness, these are not failures, but again, they are adaptations. To understand this, it helps us to look at the autonomic nervous system. And this is the part of the nervous system that operates automatically. Stephen, I believe you say Porges, but I could be mispronouncing it, so sorry, Stephen. He pioneered the polyvagal theory, which explains that our nervous system is constantly scanning for safety or threat. Often it's outside of our conscious awareness. In fact, I think I recently read somewhere that our brain and our body scans for safety 7 times a second. I mean, that's mind-blowing to me. And when safety is present, we experience connection. We experience just an ease in our body. And it's this ability for us to just rest and engage with our surroundings. However, on the flip side, when threat is perceived, even if it's no longer happening to us, our body shifts into survival states. For some of us, this looks like hyperarousal. So think fight or flight or even fawn, which I'm going to go into in later episodes. And how this shows up is chronic tension in our bodies and our minds. So racing thoughts, feeling wired but tired, anxiety coursing through our veins, and a lot of difficulty slowing down our thoughts and our actions. And for others, it can look like hypoarousal. Again, I'm going to be going into this in more detail in later episodes. Hypoarousal is freeze or shut down. And sometimes you might have referred to or heard it referred to as functional freeze. And so functional freeze or just freeze or collapse can feel like numbness, apathy, fatigue, and disconnection from sensation or any kind of motivation. And many women with complex trauma, we vacillate between these states. And we're not choosing these states. That's really important to understand. These states have been conditioned in us over time. And again, just to hone in on why this is so prominent in women, socialization, it amplifies this for us. So think about our caretaker roles that we take on, even if you're not a mother, right? We are still conditioned to be caretakers. We are taught from itty bitty to manage, to accommodate, to anticipate, and internalize. And so instead of expressing our anger, we are taught that anger is not becoming or ladylike. Instead of pulling away, our body becomes a container for what couldn't be safely expressed. And what is this doing to us on a physiological level? On a physiological level, this leads to, again, hypervigilance. And so that can show up as dysregulated arousal and disconnection from our internal cues. Like, again, I mentioned hunger and fatigue and emotional signals. The ACE study, which stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences, it found that women with early life adversity are significantly more likely to develop chronic pain, headaches, gastrointestinal issues, and autoimmune conditions. So trauma very much leaves an imprint on the body. And this is where high-achieving women often get stuck. And for me in particular, productivity has always felt very regulating until very recently. So speed can feel safer to us than stillness can. And control, let's talk about control. Control feels way more reliable to us than resting. And I can see this clearly in my own life now, this fast pace that I've been going at most of my life, this running, literally and figuratively, the control over my food intake, my sleep, and how I move in the world. Because I learned from an early age that overriding these signals equaled safety, predictability, certainty. And for a long time, again, these behaviors were highly rewarded, not just in my family of origin, but in my surroundings, in my relationships with other people outside of my family. But they were not my personality traits. They were survival adaptations. And when we really understand this, it is so liberating. When we understand this, the question begins to change. And instead of asking, what is wrong with my body? We can ask more loving, tender questions like, what did my nervous system learn that it needed to do to survive? And this shift from pathologizing to protecting is where embodiment begins. So I want to talk a little bit more about disembodiment patterns in high achieving women. And one reason embodiment feels so elusive for high achieving women is that disconnection often disguises itself as competence. So these women, they don't look disconnected. They look capable, they look responsible, and they look really reliable. So common patterns that you can look for include this constant movement. So this multitasking, this urgency, this difficulty resting without guilt, and controlling our bodies through our food intake, how much we exercise, and how much we sleep. I've mentioned this on the podcast before in some early episodes, but I can remember watching my grandmother and even my great-grandmother as a little girl, and I never sat down. We would have entire meals with my grandmother just back and forth in the kitchen. And I can remember feeling annoyed and frustrated and wanting her presence. And now I understand it. These behaviors, they are often praised as discipline. But underneath, now I know it was just all about trying to feel safe. So ignore your hunger. Push past your pain. Suppress your emotional signals to maintain performance. The nervous system begins to learn, if I don't feel it, I can function. But survival mode is never the same as presence, is it? And our awareness is key, not to judge and not to correct, but to recognize. Reclaiming our embodiment doesn't require abandoning our ambition, though. It begins with just noticing. A lot of the listeners might be wondering, well, do I just have to stop doing and stop achieving and stop moving forward with the goals in my life? Absolutely not. This is a process of reclamation so that when you do start to practice more embodiment, you can still achieve and do these things, but do them from a more grounded, caring, and tender place. So, noticing breath under pressure is a great place to start. For me, most of my life, I've been a very shallow chest breather. Noticing our tension while pushing. So if I'm physically pushing myself or mentally pushing myself through something, and I notice tension in the body, that is a signal for me to slow down, for me to get curious about what's happening. And this one might be one of the hardest ones of all that we have to conquer in this sacred work, noticing our restlessness and stillness. For a lot of us, we've always maybe been in professions where we have been on the go. And so when everything finally stops and it's our turn to rest, we might not know what to do. And so we get antsy, we get jumpy, we get bored, we get irritable. Those are all signs of restlessness when the body is just begging for stillness. So for trauma survivors, noticing itself is radical. It tells our nervous system, I can pay attention. and I'm safe enough to do this. And when we can embrace these moments, what we do is we start restoring our own agency, one choice at a time. And the goal is to do this without overwhelm. Because embodiment isn't about fixing our body. It is about re-entering a relationship with it. So let's talk a little bit about integration to close this episode. When we step back, one thing becomes clear to us, and that is hopefully that embodiment isn't a bonus in healing. In fact, embodiment is the foundation of our healing. So I'm saying that if we really want to heal in the true sense of the word, we have to be embodied, because it allows us to recognize tension in our bodies before we go into collapse. It helps us begin to feel the difference between pushing and choosing, between ambition and self-abandonment, and that's a huge one. Embodiment allows us to reconnect to our agency, our choice, and we always have a choice. And for women who have survived trauma, reclaiming the body can feel very radical. Embodiment does not ask you to give up ambition. Rather, it invites you to notice. And that noticing can create the conditions for your safety, your choice, your creativity, and your connection. So let's review our 3 key takeaways for today. Disconnection is adaptive. It's not a flaw. Trauma changes how we inhabit our bodies. And finally, reclaiming our embodiment begins with awareness. Thank you so much for joining me for this very special episode today. And if it resonated with you, I would invite you to share it with a friend and subscribe to the podcast so you'll never miss an episode. And leave a review, because this helps normalize nervous system healing for women. And this week in our midweek reframe on Wednesday, I'm going to be guiding you through a short, safe practice that you can use to begin reconnecting with your body. And if you're interested in finding out more about me and my work, you can find me at cindypayne.com or on Instagram at cindypaynrooted and on TikTok at cindypaintherapist. And remember, your body is your home. You get to inhabit it on your terms. Thanks for being here, and I'll see you next time on Reclaiming Me.